excited to be part of this symposium, and thank you to everyone for attending today on Sunday before the conference ends. So I'm going to be presenting some work that I did as part of my dissertation, and the study I worked really closely with my advisor, Dr. Abby Stewart, looking at living and working towards social change and how that predicts life aspirations, specifically related to helping one's group.
It's annoying, huh?
This doesn't work. I'll just use the keys, that's fine. So since this is a panel or a symposium on LGBT issues, I first, just wanted to wish everyone a very happy Pride Month. And of course, most of you probably already know this is a very special Pride Month because it marks the 50-year anniversary of Stonewall, kind of the start of the LGBT rights movement. And then since then, we've made a lot of progress towards social change, thanks to the resistance and the collective action of LGBT individuals and their allies. Pending things, most notably, or to a lot of people, that same-sex marriage being legalized across the US. But obviously, as all of you probably also know, there's a lot of change that still needs to happen and a lot of social progress that we can still hope to see. So as part of that, I was interested in looking at what the psychological barriers are to political engagement among LGBT individuals. And I'm sure everyone in the room can think of a lot of different things that might be barriers to socio-political engagement. But today I'll be focusing on two barriers. One is perceived stigma. So that's the perception that one thinks that others view their group negatively. And internalized stigma. So the extent to which people who are members of minority groups internalize negative attitudes about their group as applying to the self or other group members. So before I continue any further, I just want to make a quick note on internalized stigma. A lot of times when people talk about internalized stigma, it comes across as victim blaming. You know, people are culpable in their own oppression, and that's not what I'm trying to communicate here. Instead, what I'm trying to show is how perceptions of stigma and larger societal stigma generates internalized stigma, which can stop social progress caused by LGBT people themselves. So ultimately, in this model, I'm looking at how stigma and societal stigma is the starting point and ultimately becomes the ending point when we don't see social change. So with that note, as I said, I'll be talking about perceived stigma, so how people think that others view their group in society. This has been shown to lead to many negative outcomes for LGBT people, poor mental health, some of the things that Adam talked about, physical health as well. And one of the things that perceived stigma also contributes to is internalized stigma. The thought being that you have to witness stigma in society in order to be able to internalize it. So from there, I'm interested in internalized stigma, or as I said before, how group members come to hold negative views about their own group. And this has also been shown to have a number of negative outcomes for minorities, for mental health, physical health, disengagement from domains where they feel threatened. So I'm hoping to expand that and look at how internalized stigma can affect political domains specifically. How does internalized stigma affect socio-political engagement? And in terms of connecting these two, I think the one theory that seems most relevant is relative deprivation theory by Crosby. And basically, the overall theory starts with the assertion that there is a set of criteria that are necessary in order for a member of a marginalized group to perceive that there's social inequality and to want to change that inequality. And I won't go into all of the specifics today, but one of these criteria that I think is most relevant to internalized stigma is the criterion of deservingness. And essentially, deservingness is important for groups to perceive or deprivation because if they feel like they deserve something, they're going to be more likely to want to change that or want to acquire that, that symbolic object, such as equal rights. On the flip side, if they don't feel like they and their group deserve it, they're not going to be likely to want to attain it. So our thought process was that deservingness would be related to internalized stigma, because if you hold these negative views about your own group, you're probably going to be less likely to feel that your group is deserving. So as I said before, this study is part of a larger dissertation that looks at different kinds of sociopolitical engagement and how it relates to internalized stigma. So in the dissertation, I looked at lots of the typical things that you would expect that we would talk about as engagement, so attention to political issues, activism, and political actions. But for today's talk, I'll be focusing on another kind of different type of engagement in the form of life aspirations. So how people want to spend their time and how they want to devote their efforts in their work or outside their work. So that will be the focus of today's talk. And in terms of life aspirations, I'm focusing specifically on group-based life aspirations, which I define as aspirations centered around trying to improve conditions for one social identity group. These are important because previous studies have shown that privilege and marginalization can affect these type of life aspirations in the larger literature. So I'm interested in how stigma can also play a role. And then this is also important because if we can get more people to want to devote their life and work toward helping their social identity group, we can see social change increase and possibly see more changes for these groups. So as I said, this is important because we can see efforts towards social change increase if more people devote themselves to helping their groups. There's a lot of theory, especially in the occupational psychology literature, that suggests that things like power and privilege can affect this. And then there's also individual differences that can also affect this, things like personality. And we were interested in kind of teasing apart these different mechanisms and hopefully trying to create at least one potential model for how societal stigma can affect these kind of outcomes. So the other question we had was, if people are not devoting their time and efforts towards helping their group, what are they doing? So one theory that came up in the literature, which I found especially useful for answering this question, was a theory based on a book called The Best Little Boy in the World by Andrew Tobias, which basically argues that sexual minorities, they tend to perceive stigma in society, even in their families sometimes, and this leads them to see the acceptance of others as fleeting and dependent on things like whether they're out to that person. They can lose people's acceptance by coming out in some circumstances. As a result, sexual minorities learn from a young age to stake their self-worth on things that are within their own control. So rather than staking self-worth on things like the approval of others or more like social aspects, they tend to stake it on things like achievement-related outcomes, so things like power, money, status, that sort of thing. And there has been work that previously that shows that sexual minorities do tend to have higher levels of these kinds of contingencies of self-worth compared to their non-sexual minority peers. And then some work that I've done with my advisor, we actually found that internalized stigma in college students was associated with higher degrees of academic contingencies of self-worth. So seeing their academic achievement is an important part of how they view themselves. So we wanted to see whether internalized stigma would also affect these kind of markers in terms of life aspirations. So are people trying to get things like money and status as a result of higher levels of internalized stigma? So our hypotheses were that internalized stigma would predict low importance of group-based work-life goals. And we predicted that this would be mediated by internalized stigma. So we thought that people who experience more perceived stigma would have a higher likelihood of internalizing that stigma, leading to lower levels of group-based aspirations. And then finally, we thought that these different kinds of stigma would predict higher importance of extrinsic work-life goals using those similar pathways. So as I said before, this was part of a larger dissertation. In this specific study, we were looking at these kind of effects in two different groups. So one was sexual minorities, one was poor and working class folks. In order to compare them, today I'll be focusing on the sexual minorities for the purpose of this talk. We recruited them using the Amazon Mechanical Turk. And as I said, we recruited only sexual minorities and poor working class folks. Excuse me, anyone who identified as both, they were randomly assigned one set of measures to complete just because they didn't have enough time to do all the different measures. So in terms of demographics, you can see this was the overall sample. And today, like I said, I'll be focusing on the 181 sexual minorities that we recruited. When we drill down into the sexual minorities specifically, you can see in terms of gender, pretty even split between people who identify as women or men, with slightly more people identifying as women. Majority were white with a pretty good spread of that last third of different other race ethnicities. So just to go through the measures really quick. To measure perceived stigma, we used an adapted form of the collective self-esteem scale, specifically the public self-esteem items. So example item would be overall my sexual orientation group is considered good by others. To measure internalized stigma, without getting into too many details, part of the study was we wanted to kind of use existing measures and adapt some other measures and see how they worked in a factor analysis. Basically, if you want to learn more about it, you can talk to me after or ask questions. But basically, using the private self-esteem subscale from the same model, an existing internalized homonegativity measure, and adapting a modern homonegativity measure for use with one's own group, we found that all of them loaded onto a single factor, which we called internalized stigma. For life aspirations, like I said, we had two different kinds. So for group-based, we adapted the community subscale of the aspiration index items. So these were items like the things I do will make LGBT people's lives better. And then we used extrinsic aspirations for the other kinds of aspirations we were interested in. So these were things like financial awards, image, popularity. An example item is I will be financially successful. So what do we find? So this is the first model that we built. As I said before, we were testing a mediational model with group-based aspirations as the final outcome variable. And as you can see, we had a significant indirect pathway. So people who perceive more perceived stigma toward their sexual minority group, that was associated with increased levels of internalized stigma, which in turn related to lower perceived importance of these group-based aspirations, so wanting to help their groups. Interestingly, once this indirect effect was accounted for in the model, we also produced a significant direct effect that was positive, so that's an indication of suppression. And basically what that means, or at least how we would interpret it, is that for some individuals, higher perceived stigma was associated with this disengagement pathway, but for other individuals, higher perceived stigma was associated with more engagement. So they see stigma in society, they want to fight against it. So that was an unexpected finding, but it makes sense once we see it. And then for the second mediational model, we wanted to look at the other kind of aspirations, so extrinsic life aspirations. Excuse me. As you can see, whether or not it was the total effect or the direct effect, there was no significant path directly from perceived stigma to these extrinsic life aspirations. However, when we look at the indirect path, we can see that it was significant. People who had higher levels of perceived stigma, this again was associated with more internalized stigma, which in turn was related with increased levels of extrinsic aspirations. So you can see that there was kind of like, for some, wanting to engage more with their group, trying to create social change. For others, there was this desire to want to achieve things like money and status as an alternative. And I'm running low on time, so I'm gonna go. So basically, discussion points, those are all the things we found. In terms of implications, so we just wanted to stress that these findings are important because they show how internalized stigma is a critical piece of understanding the oppression of sexual minorities in society, and we should include it as part of our models. Specifically, we talk about how stigma can disengage people from collective action, instead focusing on things that benefit the self rather than the collective. And then finally, internalized stigma can hinder efforts for social progress as a result of these effects. Limitations, future directions, basically typical limitations, convenient sample, using MTurk, be nice, especially since these are aspirations. To get a more, maybe a college sample would be good because people are more in the process of deciding these kind of aspirations at that point. Correlational design, so we can infer causality. In the future, we think that future research should examine how these group-based life aspirations predict actual collective action behavior. So do people that hold these aspirations actually engage in activism or trying to get people to vote for their issues, that sort of thing. And then finally, we suspect that a similar effect might happen with different groups. And as I said before, we did some work looking at people who identified as poor working class, and we did find similar effects for them, which I'm happy to talk about later. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'd like to thank my collaborator, Dr. Abby Stewart, the Gender, Personality, and Context Lab, and all the help from all of my undergraduate RAs.